So I do feel like I spend a lot of time talking and illustrating the difference between zoom lenses and prime lenses. Now remember, when we're talking about zoom lenses, we're not necessarily talking about telephoto lenses only, lenses that get you much closer to the action, wildlife, sports, things like that. But really any lens that goes from one focal length to another is considered a zoom lens. And a prime lens is a lens that has a fixed focal length. It does not zoom, it is fixed at one focal length. Sorry if that's really simple to some of you, but I want to make sure everybody's on the same page and we're all clear about this. Now, even though I spent a lot of time talking about it, there's still different ways to illustrate. And I had an interesting question from a reader the other day that I said, hey, I want to take a few moments and illustrate that. And it wasn't just because his name was Sam Toby. I feel a little kinship there. I don't know if Toby is his actual last name. I've never seen anybody with an actual last name Toby. I didn't bother to ask. But the question basically was on the Nikon side specifically, but I don't have access to those lenses right now. I've lent my D52 out 100 to somebody. The D5300 was just reviewing unit. So we're going to do the same thing with Canon. And the question, let me just get into the question now, is basically the kit lens, the 18 to 55, which you know on the Nikon side I'm really not a fan of, but the 18 to 55 versus Nikon's 35 f1.8 prime. Now, as far as I understand, the prime lens is a fast lens compared to the zoom. Now, let's make sure we're all on the same page with that terminology there. Fast does not refer to shutter speed or how fast it's able to capture sports or focusing action. What fast means is that it can open up to a very wide aperture. So a prime lens like the 35 f1.8, its maximum aperture is f1.8. The kit lens is a variable lens, and this, I said we're starting off talking about Nikon here, but I'm going to illustrate this with Canon, and the numbers are the same. On the kit Canon 18 to 55 lens, you start off at f3.5 when you're at 18, but as you zoom up to 55, you end up at f5.6. That's a variable aperture lens. Now, when you're at 35 in the kit lens, you are at 4.5. So, while for the zoom it's 3.5 at 18. Okay, I said that. My question is, if I set the zoom to 35 and the prime at f5.6, will I get the same picture quality? I'm guessing that the prime will give me a sharper image. Am I right, and why? Now, the answer is yes. The prime is going to give you a sharper image. Why? Well, the prime's got less moving parts. It's got less bits in there that the light has to pass through. And that's going to be better for clarity, which means sharpness, so the image is going to look better. However, if I've scheduled all my videos correctly, a video went out yesterday that talked about when we're up around f5.6, that it really becomes kind of a great equalizer for a lot of lenses, and even cheap ones can look just as good as a better one. I'll throw some illustrations up at the end of this video where we carefully look at some of these samples and some stills. But right now I'm running video on 3 different cameras, and I wanted to just kind of illustrate the possible differences. It's not directly answering this question, but the possible differences. So right now over here I have the Canon 70D with the 18 to 55 lens on it. It is currently set at its widest aperture for 35 millimeters, which I said was f4.5. For proper exposure, when I'm shooting my videos, I always shoot, almost always, at 1/50th of a second to match that shutter speed rule in video. And that set my ISO around, what would I say, 1600. So I'm shooting at ISO 1600 f4.5. The 5D Mark III, that's set at f4, ISO 1600 as well. And then over here we've got the T5i with the newish Sigma 35 f1.4, and we're shooting at f1.4. So our depth of field, you should see a huge difference between f1.4 and that f4.5 over on the 70D. So right away you see a big difference there. You're able to control your depth of field much more, and by being able to open up and let in a lot more light, you can shoot at a much lower ISO. So the ISO right now on the T5i is ISO 200. But here, through the magic of technology, what we're going to do is to bring it up to aperture 4.5 and ISO 1600 roughly. Now, not a completely fair comparison. We're kind of, not scientific here because we're running this on a 70D and a T5i. They're not the same sensor. They're similar, but the 70D definitely is an improved sensor, and noticeably so in most of my testing. So, in this video, I'm curious to see, is the T5i with this nice prime lens shooting at an aperture that is not anywhere near its maximum aperture for that focal length. Is it any sharper? So we'll answer that. And as I said, we'll throw up some images at the end. But there are a lot of reasons why it's nice to own a prime lens. One is it is sharper across the range of apertures, almost always, versus a zoom lens. Another is that oftentimes it gives you better quality. Actually, I just said that, I'm saying the same thing over again. Another thing is that it allows you to open up that aperture much, much wider, letting in more light, letting you drop your ISO, which is going to give you better quality and better, sharper images. So, let's look at a couple of samples. So I want to interrupt and put in a part 2 to this video. I wasn't necessarily planning on this, but as I started to look through the footage as I was putting the first part of the video together, and one, it's hard to make comparisons when I was shooting on 2 different cameras. I thought that was going to be true. But you know, really with the video, there's just not quite enough difference, especially shooting on 2 different cameras, to make a good judgment between these. So what I want to take a few moments and do now is shoot with the 35 f1.4 on the Canon T5i. We're shooting it at f4.5, and in a minute we're going to switch over and put the kit lens on the T5i. Yes, right now I know it's on the 70D, but we're going to put it on the T5i, and we're going to look at these two side by side. I have to say a couple of points. One, as my video the other day said, when you get up into that sweet spot of the lenses, f4, 4.5, 5.6, in the video the other day I said f5.6, but even at f4 and f4.5, it really is a great equalizer of lenses, and something as cheap as a $100, $120, well, used, it sells for a little bit more than that, kit lens is performing as well as an $800, $900 prime lens at those aperture values. Now, you don't buy the Sigma and to use necessarily at f4.5, and it is definitely a little bit sharper. As I said, I'll throw some images up at the end. I saw differences in those, but in the video, not a whole lot of difference. When the kit lens is on, and so these are split now side by side at f4.5, they're very similar. There may be some slight differences, but for video, you're not seeing a whole lot. As I said, you're buying this lens so that you can shoot in really low light by opening up that aperture really wide and keeping your ISO low for cleaner images. That's one way to see a difference. Or to be able to control your depth of field in the background. Now, just for fun, because I have it here, let's switch these. Let's switch to the 70D as well. All right, so now I have the 70D on with the Sigma 35 f1.4. Shooting though at f4.5, actually the identical settings to the T5i. This isn't a review of the 70D or the T5i, I've done that. This isn't a review of the Sigma or the kit lens, I've talked about those. I haven't reviewed the Sigma fully yet, but I will be soon. This is really just kind of a quality difference at f4.5, which is not a challenging aperture for the Sigma, certainly, and maybe somewhat of a challenging aperture for the kit lens, but as I said, as I've been talking, the tests really aren't showing that. And so now as I've been talking, I've got the kit lens on the 70D thrown up side by side so you can see if there's any differences. Make sure you're watching these in 1080p. I really don't think you're going to see any differences in the 480 YouTube compressed version, but maybe in the 1080p. So let's go back to the regular video now and wrap it up. One other part of the question that he had asked was, so the prime lens does not have VR or IS or OS, which is your image stabilization, your vibration reduction if you're coming from the Nikon side. How does that affect shooting at the slower shutter speeds? Well, that's a great question. A lens like the kit lens, the 18 to 55, does have IS or VR in it. You should be able to shoot at slower shutter speeds. Your general rule of thumb is your shutter speed should be faster than your focal length. So if I'm shooting at 35 millimeters, my shutter speed should be at least 1/35 of a second, actually a little bit faster. I have other videos to talk about this to compensate for the crop factor on your crop sensor cameras. So, but with image stabilization, I can shoot 2 to 3 stops below safely, usually. A lot of usuallys. It really depends on how much caffeine you've had, how steady your hands are, but you can shoot slower than that speed. With a prime lens that does not have that image stabilization in there, you should stick to that rule and shoot. But because you can open up to a wider aperture, it's less of an issue. So that's why oftentimes very few primes have image stabilization built in. Those that do are quite pricey and often don't close down as quite as wide as other lenses. But that's all I want to say right now. I'm just going to throw up some samples for us to look at. Thanks so much for watching, and if you haven't already, please subscribe. So let's take a look at some of these samples. Here's the Sigma 35, shooting at f5.6, again, sweet spot of this lens, and pretty much the sweet spot of the Canon 18-55 STM. Very little difference between the two. We can look at them side by side or top and bottom here, Sigma on top, Canon at the bottom, again at f5.6. Really not seeing much difference, especially once they're compressed and thrown in as JPEGs here in this YouTube clip. And then a 300% crop, you still don't see much. Here we are again, another shot side by side. We're shooting now at f4.5, which is the widest aperture available to the Canon 18-55 for this focal length. And in my shots that I looked at in Lightroom, the Sigma definitely is noticeably sharper, but not hugely so. You can notice the difference, but it's not huge. Now this was a shot of the shallow depth of field that's achievable shooting with a Sigma at f1.4, and then of course again the widest aperture on the Canon 18-55 is at f4.5. If you'd like to see these samples in more detail, just click the link down below this video to head over to the blog where I have some of these, and I'll be uploading more as I take some more test shots. What did you take away from this video? I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. Leave a comment down below. Thank you so much.